Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a moment to connect before we get started. Thank you so much. All right, I'll get us going this morning. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Jess Leinhardt. I am the director of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus. I just have a few details to share before we get started in earnest. This meeting is being recorded. It will be available on the GLLC website following the meeting, and I believe we'll also be sending it out to all attendees. We will be having a Q&A portion at the end of Helena's presentation. You can type your questions into the Q&A box or raise your hand and indicate, and I can give audio access. And this is our agenda for the morning, just to give us an idea of what to expect. We'll have welcoming remarks from Senator Baer before we go into the presentation from the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Again, that Q&A will happen at the end of the Alliance for the Great Lakes presentation, and then we will have Senator Baer sharing a legislative perspective before we close out the meeting. I am pleased to now introduce Senator Rosemary Baer from Michigan, who is the chair of the GLLC Water Use Committee, to deliver her welcoming remarks. Senator Baer?
Thank you, Jess. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's GLLC web meeting. The GLLC coordinates regional action for us, provides education, creates a space for collaboration for state and provincial leaders across the binational Great Lakes St. Lawrence region. We work to advance our policy agenda through meetings like these, task forces and committees, and our policy institutes and annual meetings, which are great, by the way. Hopefully you can come to the next one. The caucus has been looking into large water users in the basin for the past year through our water use committee. I'll be sharing a bit more about our work at the end of today's meeting, but if you're interested in this topic, I'd like to invite you, my legislative colleagues on the call, to join our committee by reaching out to Jess, and you can fill out the form in the chat or you can send an email. Thanks for joining us today, and I'm going to pass things back over to Jess so we can introduce our speaker and get into this fantastic presentation. Thank you.
Senator Baer, and I'm gonna invite Helena to start sharing her screen and pull the presentation up. So Helena Vulzer is from the Alliance for the Great Lakes. She is the Senior Source Water Policy Manager and executes policy analysis, advocacy, and project implementation under the agriculture and water restoration sections of the Alliance's strategy. She implements work across the basin, particularly in Ohio, to achieve the Alliance's agriculture and water goals. Prior to joining the Alliance, Helena served as an attorney for the Ohio Legislative Service Commission for over a decade. In that role, she provided legal research, bill analysis, and legislative drafting services on natural resources, agriculture, environment, transportation, and public safety matters to members of the Ohio General Assembly. So thank you for being here, Helena, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today. As you may know, we released a report back in August, the Alliance did, called A Finite Resource, Managing the Growing Water Needs of Data Centers, Critical Minerals, Mining, and Agriculture. As we really viewed these three sectors, it was an opportunity for us to explore how these three sectors are kind of converging on the region's Great Lakes water resources. And so we'll spend the bulk of the time talking today about data centers, which is the one everyone is the most interested in. But I do want to acknowledge the other sectors of the report. Critical minerals mining is mining for things like nickel and copper. These minerals are needed both for the transition to green energy, as well as within data centers themselves and the chips, in the inside of the servers. And then with agriculture, we're also seeing an increase in water use, especially during peak summer months. We're seeing an increase in irrigation in places like Northwest Ohio and parts of Wisconsin, where we historically hadn't seen as much irrigation used there. So we have, all of this water use increasing throughout the region, and the report really explores that convergence of demand. So I like to start with this map, just illustrating where data centers are located throughout the Great Lakes region. This map looks at those that have been built so far, and it's probably already out of date from the 14th. But I like to show it because it illustrates how data centers like to cluster around major metropolitan areas. And this is because of access to things like energy transmission lines, high-speed internet, fiber optic. It was once thought these could locate out in rural areas, and we're seeing some of that shift now with data centers bringing on their own energy. So you will see some located out in more rural areas. But for the most part, we're seeing this clustering effect happening. Um, but the real shift we're seeing now too is a shift to hyperscale data centers. These are much larger facilities. Data centers have been with us since about the 2010s. They're used for things that we use every day. But the shift now is to data centers to power generative AI, which really requires these vast processing capabilities that only the hyperscale facilities can really handle. In my research, I found when evaporative cooling is used, these facilities can use between 1 and 5 million gallons of water per day. There's a lot of variation depending on the cooling method that is used. And this definition here that I have of hyperscale, I tried to explore what is the floor, what's the minimum that we would consider hyperscale. So it's more than 10,000 square feet, more than 5,000 servers, more than 20 megawatts of load. And I think in many communities, it's much, much larger. We're talking hundreds of acres for some of these facilities. But to put things in perspective, we did this analysis. So a data center using 1 MGD over the course of the year is the same to 12,000 Americans use over that time, just to give perspective on how much water use that really is. So I mentioned that there can be a variety of cooling methods used. At the time of my research, evaporative cooling was really the most common in the industry, and this is where water is being pushed through a membrane to bring down the temperature inside of the server room. It has very high consumptive water use. More than half of that water evaporates off in this method. Lower electricity usage, but high water consumptive. And when we talk about direct water use inside of data centers, it's this consumptive use that's not returned to the watershed that we're most concerned with. These other methods, liquid immersion and direct to chip, involve directly exposing equipment to water, and we have questions about, are there contaminants in that discharged wastewater? And then closed loop is where we're really seeing a shift now. I know Meta has said they would use liquid immersion in their new data centers. Closed loop systems I'm seeing more and more of now. And these are where coolant and water are directly delivered to server racks as opposed to trying to bring down the temperature inside the room. I've heard conflicting information as to whether or not that water needs to be refreshed from time to time. But you also have that question about the water quality side of things if we are refreshing and replacing that water after a certain amount of time. But these are more efficient from a water perspective. But they're still large energy users, and we'll get into indirect water use in a minute. But right now we're just talking about the direct water needs. And then finally, air cooling is just large fans, has really high electricity use, and is really going to be insufficient when we're talking about hyperscale data centers and the needs of AI. So after that water evaporates, the rest is then discharged as wastewater or recirculated if we're talking about evaporative cooling. But even that recirculation isn't forever. That water can't go around forever and ever in that data center. There can be pH changes and scaling that happens. So eventually there'll be need for a discharge with evaporative cooling. And so that water comes out warm and will therefore be regulated as a wastewater treatment under wastewater treatment laws. And just recognizing that there is a need for wastewater treatment capacity when we're talking about evaporative cooling because water is likely being discharged in this method. So therefore, I think we are seeing this shift now to the closed loop and immersive cooling systems. And that might be where the industry is going. At least the large players are headed that way. But this is a bit of a shell game because when we shift to a method that uses less water, we still have large energy use. And that indirect water use occurs at the power plant when we're powering these facilities with nuclear or fossil fuels at the power plant. Water is still high consumptive use of water for those energy generation types. So I'm going to zoom out and just look at a big picture here. How is Great Lakes water used? And this is overall water use. This is not consumptive use. But energy generation is the highest use of water when we look at it from just a water use perspective. Public supply at 15%. And you can see agriculture is actually a very small percentage, 2%. But these percentages don't equate when we look at consumptive use, right? So this is the percent that's not returned to the watershed. And this is a chart from our report that kind of illustrates these categories using the Great Lakes Regional Water Use Database data. And we can see that, for example, agriculture falls into this irrigation category, has really high consumptive use associated with it. And we can also see thermoelectric there at 15%. And so the indirect use by a hyperscale data center, I can't underscore this enough, can still be really substantial. I've pulled this example. Clean Wisconsin, one of our partners, recently did some excellent analysis looking at the Vantage data center in Port Washington, Wisconsin, using best available information. And I can't underscore this enough. A lot of these numbers are estimates based on the type of fuel generation and cooling method within the data center. And we're not accounting for seasonal variation or hourly use rates here. But at full build out, this is a 3.5 gigawatt facility. You can see, depending on whether it's coal, natural gas, or nuclear, you can still have the potential for really large water withdrawals, as well as really large consumptive use of water. And so, taking a natural gas withdrawal here of 54 million gallons a day, that's equivalent to almost a million Wisconsinites, more than twice every home, business, and manufacturer in Green Bay. So you can see that the indirect water use can still be substantial when we're talking about a large energy using data center. But one of the primary gaps with the water use footprint is that we don't really know what that individual water footprint of a data center is. Unless the data center itself withdraws water, the registration and consumptive use reporting requirements that we have don't necessarily apply. These requirements don't apply where large water users are hooked into municipal systems. And when it comes to data centers, more than 97% of them are connecting to municipal water supplies. So they fall into this category, and their water use ends up getting reported as public supply. And because there are no requirements to report on their water use, less than a third of data centers are even tracking how much water they're using. And then again, underscoring this indirect water use with power generation, we also can't calculate how much of that water use is being driven by the data center sector. So we have a lot of transparency gaps here, and also non-disclosure agreements that are being used. They're common in economic development, can obscure how much water is even proposed to be used at the outset of some of these projects. The Alliance got into this work because we have a long history of working on the Great Lakes Compact, which you might be familiar with. In general, the compact prohibits diversions of Great Lakes water outside of the Great Lakes Basin. There are some limited exceptions for communities that straddle the basin line, and there are procedures within the compact to allow for that. But by and large, we are not shipping water overseas. We are not piping it out west. And so that means we may face more demand for water here at home. But the compact also requires states to manage their Great Lakes water use within the basin. And some states have gone beyond that and established statewide programs kind of under this prong to have conservation and efficiency goals and programs, and to establish and follow common water use reporting protocols to this Great Lakes Regional Water Use Database so we can get a picture of Great Lakes water use throughout the region. And I pull this phrase out of the compact specifically because this is very much the message that our report tries to send, is that these programs were, set around 2008 when the compact was agreed to, but they were never meant to be static. They were meant to adjust to new demands and the potential impacts of cumulative effects and climate. And that's very much the case that we are trying to make. So beyond the compact, I went one step further and examined state groundwater laws. And what I found was that by and large, they're sort of inadequate to allow states to curb or limit groundwater use before there's been some kind of adverse resource impact. And for Great Lakes state residents, this is really relevant because depending which state you're talking about, between 40 and 75% of Great Lakes state residents are getting their drinking water from groundwater. So I've pulled out a few examples here. We don't have to go through all of them, but and there's much more detail in the report on some of this, but for Ohio, if there's a dispute over groundwater, it's primarily resolved by litigation. There's a temporary dispute mechanism in statute, but there are no rules sort of regarding groundwater stress areas or allowing the department to sort of designate those right now. Michigan, sort of on the flip side, allows groundwater, these are permitted groundwater users, to form a water users committee. Forming that is voluntary, but if it's been formed, the state can convene it to try and resolve disputes before going to litigation. And then Indiana and Illinois, fairly similar. They can establish these restricted use areas or emergency restrictions, but only after there's been some kind of finding that there is a threat to groundwater supplies. So, it's a very reactive approach to groundwater management rather than proactive approach. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later on as well. So beyond that, I talked at the top about critical minerals mining. Also, we have these, convergence of demands from different sectors coming to the Great Lakes region. Critical minerals mining, more of an issue in parts of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota that have these copper and nickel resources. Very water intensive industry, both from the mining perspective and then the processing that needs to happen to process those materials, creates process mine waste that cannot really be recycled at this time. We have other large industrial water users coming to the region, for example, semiconductor chip manufacturing, quantum computing, these other facilities that may fall into the same category as data centers when it comes to reporting their water use in the public supply category if they are connecting to municipal supplies. And then irrigation from agriculture, really seeing, with climate change and seasonal variations. I live in Ohio and we've had, tremendous drought this summer and last summer, perhaps becoming more of a trend. But both agriculture and data centers, if we're talking about evaporative cooling, will require more water in the summertime when it's hot. And so that's something we need to be thinking about and be aware of. And then population growth as well. At this point in time, I don't suspect it's the case that folks are moving necessarily for climate reasons just yet. Some of the fastest growing cities are actually in the South, where you would not move for climate reasons, but people do move for employment. And what we've seen with data centers, and then there are conflicting reports about, this indirect employment generation aspect of them. We know they don't create many direct jobs, but they do lead to some additional economic growth. And if that's the case, then we also have to be prepared and planning for public water supply because of population growth. And then finally, we already have existing groundwater conflicts in the Great Lakes region. I pointed to Southwest Michigan, which has seen conflicts between homeowners and agriculture and developers over groundwater resources. The Central Sands region in Wisconsin, primarily agricultural impact there. Same with Little Rock Creek in Minnesota. And then just west of South Bend, Indiana, there's an EV battery plant and data center that are suspected to have caused residents' wells to run dry. And so I think the investigation is still ongoing, last I have seen, as to whether or not it was caused by that. But it happened during the dewatering process, and that's when groundwater is pumped out to make way for construction of these facilities. Remains to be seen if once those facilities are built, if that drawdown effect will continue. You may have seen the piece in the New York Times about the facility in Georgia. A similar consequence there. It was the dewatering process that initially triggered that, and there's dispute about whether or not that continues to be an issue there because of the facility itself. So I wanted to spend a minute talking about how these facilities can come to be in communities, and I have to give credit for the next two slides to an organization called Freshwater in Minnesota. Who put together some of this content, but typically speaking, economic development teams are citing this project, and at this phase, the water managers and regional planners aren't typically being involved. And then next, the municipality is approached for land and power needs, and this is where the non-disclosure agreements can kind of come into play. Partners are approached with a very short timeline in which to make a decision, and then we have an agreement reached, and things go public, and this is where we have the municipal water supply connection, and 97% are falling into this category. And then here, finally, at the end, we have concerns being raised by the public and legislators and water managers. And I think this is part of the reason that we've seen so much resistance and perhaps backlash to the siting of data centers, is this public being consulted here at the very final stage. So to the extent that it's possible, this list of questions I thought was really excellent to be asking during the beginning processes of siting some of these facilities. What are the water quantity and quality needs? What is the water source, and is it already at risk? Are there opportunities for water reuse, for closed loop systems, for reusing stormwater or wastewater? What are the local water bodies that might be impacted, or private well owners? Have there been any water projections reviewed from any regional demand planning studies? And this is something I'll touch on later. Could you co-locate a complementary industry or a land use? And could you attract another business to share water resources or reuse the discharged wastewater from the data center? So just some questions to be asking that I think could be used at the early stages of siting data centers. But I also want to touch on why local solutions to solving this problem aren't quite enough to handle the scope and scale of it, right? We have this threat to groundwater integrity that we've highlighted in the report based on this convergence of demand throughout the region. What is the cumulative impact of adding all of these data centers in every community across the Great Lakes Basin? Then there's also this water energy nexus that I spoke about, right? The idea that we have this indirect water use occurring at power plants. And that is very difficult for a local municipality to consider the environmental impact of the increase of water use at a power plant that may be totally outside of their jurisdiction if they're purchasing power from the grid, for example. And then state economic development corporations may not necessarily be making decisions with local input. And in my research, it sort of found that water demands aren't really being considered at this stage. And so, local communities are now enacting temporary moratoria or restrictions, and that can kind of create a patchwork. And I've seen that play out in at least one community where the community enacted a moratoria temporarily, and the data center developer went to another community and sited the facility there. So you may pit communities against one another, and community benefit agreements, I'll talk more on those as well, are one tool communities can use at this point. I think Saline Township in Michigan was able to secure one of these agreements to sort of bring some transparency back, but then also some kind of water resources benefit. But finally, I've seen this response now from state legislatures. There was a bill enacted in Montana on this front, and Ohio has introduced a piece of legislation as well that would severely limit not only local control, but actually state control over data center regulation. This particular bill would require that any regulation have a compelling government interest and that the regulation be narrowly tailored to that interest. And that's a very high bar for communities to meet and for the state to meet when the normal standard is kind of rational basis. Is the regulation just rationally related to the government's interests? So I think that this is a challenge, as communities who may enact any kind of restrictions, we may see this response at the state level. So turning then to, regional solutions are one aspect of our report that we made some recommendations on. These are recommendations that we submitted in response to the draft IJC report. You'll see they largely mirror the state level recommendations. But the first one are to conduct regional water demand studies that consider environmental and ecosystem needs and collaborating amongst states if you have watersheds that aren't respecting state lines, to track and report water use that will help improve the data in the Great Lakes Regional Water Use Database, to expand upon and strengthen our existing registration consumptive use permitting programs, including considering lowering those consumptive use permit thresholds, which really haven't been considered since the time of the compact, and then developing conservation and efficiency standards that are specifically tailored for large water using industries. And I'll go into more detail about these items at the state level here next. So starting with planning and mapping, I think there's a need in many states for more funding and resources for groundwater mapping so that we're aware of where our groundwater resources are, aquifer recharge rates, and those kinds of things. Broadly speaking, that requires funding. And then these regional demand studies that states like Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana have started to undertake. Ohio recently completed a 15-county study for the central Ohio area, looking at demand for water and as well as population growth, factoring that in as well. And it identifies gaps in capacity at 2030, 2040, and 2050. So some communities in Ohio, it identifies that there will be gaps in water capacity based on this survey. The state will be moving on to do the Southwest Ohio portion, Southwest Ohio next, and I believe the understanding is they will do the entire state eventually. Illinois has done some of these studies, and it's my understanding Indiana has authorized its studies by executive order, but there's a need for some additional funding resources to support that continued framework for supply and demand. But these studies should really be incorporated as part of the ongoing water management and conservation programs versus one-time projects. They will need to be updated as more of these facilities are built. And they should also evaluate ecosystem and environmental needs as part of the demand calculation. In Ohio's case, things like how much water for fish populations and groundwater-based flows. This was not factored into the Central Ohio study in the first round, but we're hopeful that perhaps this will be something considered in the next study, so that when we give that picture of where water is available and where it's not and make siting decisions based on that, we're doing it with these kinds of factors in mind. And then the whole point of conducting these studies is so that the economic development agencies and the local governments can turn to them in their planning and deciding where to site these facilities. Data centers can very much have more or less water resources impact, and so site selection is very, very important. And then transparency and accountability. The gap we identified with this connection to public supplies is something, and just in general, the development of this industry has a need for more transparency and accountability. So if we're talking on the front end, public disclosure requirements would be something to look at. California is a state that recently enacted legislation on this front. They did it as part of a business license, a requirement to disclose proposed water use, and this was vetoed by the governor very recently in October. But there's a potential here to consider whether or not that should apply to all large water users above a certain threshold rather than just data centers. And in California's case, this is a bill specific to just data centers. But I think it's something we should consider for all large water users above a certain threshold rather than targeting just this specific industry. And then community benefit agreements are something that I sort of view as an interim measure to involve communities, to increase transparency, and can help alleviate some of that pushback and the need for moratoria that we've seen by a more transparent involvement of the community. And the example that I pointed to in our report was the construction of the Los Angeles airport in 2011. really had some provisions that helped reduce air pollution. So reducing engine idling at gates and electrifying those gates to reduce air pollution was something that was agreed to. And what made that agreement effective was a continued monitoring and reporting schedule to go along with that community benefit agreement. And then there's also a need for ongoing reporting. New Jersey is a state that has enacted legislation on this front. It's my understanding that the governor there has conditionally vetoed that, so it would sort of delay the effect of it. And so I'm not sure what the legislature will do, if they will concur or attempt to override that veto. But it establishes, I believe it's monthly reporting requirements for both water and energy use, which is really key because, as I talked about, that indirect water use, right, associated with power generation. Again, here, I think we can consider, building upon the framework set by the Great Lakes Compact, which already has existing registration and consumptive use permit requirements associated for users that withdraw their own water. But here we're saying, let's look at perhaps considering those that connect to municipal supplies and making those requirements applicable to those types of users. To my knowledge, there's no state in the country in the United States that has enacted any kind of ongoing reporting requirement. But the European Union did enact annual reporting beginning in September 2024 and left it up to member nations as to how to implement that requirement best in their nation. But I bring this up to point out that a lot of these players are international companies that are operating globally. And so if we have this requirement in Europe, we can start to question why we don't have a similar requirement here in the United States. So I brought this chart up from the report. I realize this is very small, but it's there if you want to consult it later. I just compared the consumptive use permitting thresholds. Again, these are applicable to users that are withdrawing their own water and consuming water above a certain threshold. So you can see they vary pretty widely depending on the state you're talking about. I'll note here that Illinois is listed as not applicable, and it's because there's a sort of an exception that applies to Illinois withdrawals. They do have a 2 million gallon a day consumptive use requirement for withdrawals from Lake Michigan, but it's not necessarily required by the compact. There's more on that on the report if you're interested. But we can see here there's generally a variance between the states at which that threshold applies. This is for consumptive use permitting. In all of the states, I believe it's the case that the withdrawal threshold at which you have to register with the state and report annually is 100,000 gallons per day. So a farmer, for example, that withdraws that amount or has the capacity to must generally register with the state. So I want to talk a little bit about Michigan's program because they have a very interesting water conservation and efficiency program that has an assessment process for these 100,000 gallon per day withdrawals that I mentioned. So the farmer, for example, withdrawing that amount over a 30-day period, they're subject to an environmental impact standard. And they have something very unique called a water withdrawal assessment tool that assesses whether or not that withdrawal will cause any kind of adverse resource impact. So this is a little bit more proactive, at least with respect to the groundwater users that we already have and are registering their withdrawals. And that's tracked online in a portal. So this water withdrawal assessment tool, this is at the Huck 10 scale, I believe. Now it's not perfect. It does not consider impacts to things like inland lakes or wetlands, but it does measure potential adverse resource impacts to local streams and rivers. If it passes, then the person can immediately know whether or not they can register their withdrawal. There's some caveats to it. It doesn't go back before 2009. But then if a registration, fails that tool, you can have a site-specific review. And there are many more details about larger withdrawals registering throughout this tool. But there's an annual reporting requirement associated with it. And this is what we're saying is we could consider making this kind of a tool applicable to users regardless of whether or not they're withdrawing their own water or connecting to municipal supplies. So then moving on from here, we have water efficiency standards in some of the states. By and large, these are self-certifying and only apply to the permit holders or the registered users in the states that we discussed, only for those withdrawing their own water. And so we have a need for more conservation and water efficiency standards for data centers or for large water users. And I have an example here from Connecticut. Senate Bill 1292 would require this multi-agency energy efficiency performance standards study and require some rules to be adopted both between the Energy and Environmental Protection Commissions that sort of prioritize not only energy use, but water use and consider best practices. And this is something that's very much lacking in the states right now. We lack an ability to compare and contrast what are the most efficient water use methods or cooling methods within data centers. And this could be very helpful in that arena, as there is this ability to not silo these standards, but consider them simultaneously. We know that data centers can recirculate water. They could potentially co-locate with wastewater treatment plants, and they can also make use of non-potable water. And this is something that Ohio and Illinois are starting to take a closer look at. Ohio and Illinois have established a chapter of something called the Water Reuse Association to explore this further. What are the laws and regulations that might need to change to allow for non-potable reuse of water for cooling in data centers, for example? And so I know the Ohio chapter is a little further ahead. They're in the process of creating some white papers around this right now. And so we may see something there. And this is a long-term project, but it's the beginning of something on that front. So I like this slide because I wanted to provide something to legislators that they often ask that I know from my past experience is well, okay, this is great, but how do we pay for it, right? Every state throughout the Great Lakes region has enacted some sort of sales and use tax incentive over the last 20 years to attract this industry. It's our position that these could be scaled back or eliminated, but they could also be redirected to pay for some of these programs and initiatives that I've outlined here. I found it interesting that in the last budget session, the Ohio legislature actually proposed repealing its sales and use tax incentive that was ultimately vetoed by the governor. But I do think that there's a look at this as to whether or not these kinds of incentives specifically for data centers are necessary, as it is millions of dollars that are not being directed to some of the water resource planning that we could redirect them to. And even the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, in its most recent report on the impact of data centers, suggested tying these sales and use tax incentives to performance. So I thought that was very telling. And then permit and registration fees. If we open up, the consumptive use permitting and the registration requirements that we already have to new users, to those connecting to municipal supplies, there could be an opportunity to look again at consumptive use permit fees and whether or not there needs to be a fee for registration as well to accommodate some of this. So states in the region, I know Minnesota has enacted some legislation recently. It's very specific to data centers. So I wanted to bring up this bill, which requires a pre-application step to facilities that would use more than 100 million gallons of water per year. That's about 274,000 gallons a day, to put it in that context. But again, this is for users that are withdrawing their own water and doesn't get to the municipal users that are connecting to municipal supplies. It also requires any data center inquiry to be referred to the Minnesota's sort of business first one-stop program to then be referred onward to whatever departments it may need to go to for permitting and that kind of conversation. There's also legislation at the federal level that I just wanted to raise awareness of. There is a water reuse tax credit piece of legislation that would provide a 30% tax credit to scale up water reuse. And then sort of on the flip side, there is this AI sandbox bill that would allow for a waiver from federal regulations for 2 years for any kind of AI data center that feels that the regulation sort of stands in the way of their development. So I'm not sure what the progress or the status is of these pieces of legislation, but just wanted to raise awareness of those two. To learn more about, our work, all of our information is available on the website. Our report is there. There's a fact sheet as well as a webinar that I did in collaboration with Sarah Walling of Clean Wisconsin and Joao Freire of University of Virginia, who's looking at the economic and energy impacts of data centers as well. I'll be continuing to do this type of lawmaker education. I'm also preparing a toolkit for local communities that are facing data center proposals, and sort of meeting with our partners and collaborating with partners throughout the region on these kinds of large water use issues. So at this point, I'll stop sharing and take any questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Helena. That was excellent. Just a reminder to type questions into the Q&A box and we will go through them. The first one here is speaking to the conflict between legislatures and governors. So any additional insight you can offer to some of the legislation you went over where it was passed through the legislature, but then stopped by governor, the executive branch.
Yeah, I guess I don't know that I have any words of advice or wisdom there, but I have taken a look at least for example, I mentioned the sales and use tax incentive in Ohio. That veto message was very focused about the need to balance economic development. But water resources, for example, weren't mentioned in that veto message. So I think it's a difficult approach if governors are vetoing some of this legislation. How do we surpass that? I know the veto override exists, and in Ohio's case, there was talk about perhaps coming back to override that particular veto. So there is that process as well, but of course that requires a much higher threshold of the legislature to pass those kinds of initiatives. But I do think that, there's probably perhaps a need for some education on the executive front as well about the water resources impacts here, and perhaps that can help make the case that we do need to balance economic development with everything else that we have, including water resource impacts.
Great. And then another question here. So, what is the most important thing that maybe you came across in your report for industries when they're siting a data center? What is drawing them to the Great
Hmm.
Lakes, for example, and kind of anything you can add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a complex business decision, right? And water does factor into that equation. I don't think it's highest on the list. I think highest on the list are things like the incentives. Energy access, I know, is key. There are certain states throughout the region, for example, New York is somewhat power constrained, right? And so for that reason, when we look at those data centers that are planned, New York has far fewer new data centers coming online, and more are coming here to more further Midwest states like Ohio and Illinois. Ohio and Illinois are, I should say, Illinois is 4, Ohio is 5 in the country in terms of the number of data centers that they have right now. And I think that growth is expected to continue. But in other states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota are seeing more development now of these hyperscale facilities, and they haven't had as many data centers historically to this point. But the ones that they are seeing now are much, much larger.
Thank you. And oh, go ahead, Senator Bear.
I don't need to take cuts, but I can't get into the chat because I'm one of the speakers. So I put my hand up. Thank you. I wanted to ask a couple of things. I don't know if we got a long list of questions, but really quick on the non-potable use of non-potable water. Is that not still consumptive? It's gone then. It doesn't ever regenerate. It's just gone,
Yeah,
right?
that's a great question. I think it very much depends on the cooling method being employed, right? That's where we have more or less consumptive use. With the non-potable reuse, I think it really is a strategy to sort of mitigate freshwater use, right? The potable finished treated drinking water has gone through a lot of steps to make it to you and I to consume to be safe to drink. And so by reusing non-potable water, we could mitigate some of our freshwater reuse, our drinkable water. And I know Ohio is very interested in this because of some of the regional water study that I mentioned, identifying some of these gaps in capacity. Water reuse and non-potable reuse is being suggested as a possible solution to that problem, as opposed to drilling more wells or bringing more water into the system as a way to kind of serve as a relief valve for the additional data centers that are being added. So I don't know exactly the answer to that question. I think it very much depends on the cooling method, and I'm not an engineer, so I need someone with a little more expertise than me to help me answer that one.
Also, that kind of leads to the follow-on is about closed loop. I'm pretty familiar with that. I've lived with closed loop systems in my homes for 40
Mhm.
years, kind of when they were brand new even. And they go and they cool underground. And we do the same thing with our state capitol. It's all cooled and heated with groundwater heat exchange, right? Closed loop basically. And the water, first of all, does not need to regenerate much, but there's lots of things to talk about there. But really, why couldn't they, I know they're big and they're, use more water than our capital does, but the capital's pretty big. So why not do an underground loop where the ground itself cools the water instead of having to spit it out and have it go through wastewater treatment because it's warm, that's impactful to the environment, of course. If we just did the underground cooling, you wouldn't have that same problem.
Yeah, that's a good question too, and I don't know the answer. Again, I think I need a data center designer or engineer to kind of answer that question as to whether or not that's feasible with the type of cooling that they're trying to do. It's my understanding that the closed loop system with a data center takes that coolant and the water and runs it across those server racks to diffuse that heat. And that's about the extent of my knowledge on how those systems actually work. But I think it sort of underscores the point that I was trying to make about the lack of knowledge that we have in terms of these cooling systems and how they work and what is more efficient and what isn't. The ability to really compare and contrast them is very much lacking in terms of even how much water they do use, right? I don't have figures for how much water a closed loop system uses. I can tell you it depends. It may depend on how big the facility is. But I know generally speaking, it's less than evaporative cooling. But I think there's a real need for transparency here in terms of water use reporting, both at the outset of citing the project as to how much water it's going and energy it's going to require, and then on the back end with these ongoing, more continuous reporting requirements in case anything changes on that side.
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece of it, and if we can find ways, we're working hard on that for other reasons about reporting in Michigan. So with any luck, we'll get all of those things at the same time. We'll be having mandated reporting for other purposes.
Mhm.
So that'll be useful for us. It was one of the few things we did actually push on the municipal providers because we could not get the data centers, the big ones, especially the big companies, to agree to do any reporting. But if it's going through a provider, we can then tell actually whether
Mhm.
they've got a sudden increase and we can see what's happening there.
Okay.
So there's some things that we can get to that, but we're still trying to push to do real reporting. That's the right answer.
Mhm.
And maybe it's incentives.
Yeah, and I think there's a real opportunity, right, as I mentioned too, to look at all large water users because data centers are the hot topic today, right? And those are the larger water users that we're seeing. But in other places, I know Illinois has this quantum computing facility, the semiconductor chip manufacturing may be the next thing wave that we see. And so I think narrowly tailoring regulations to just data centers misses an opportunity to really look at what is the appropriate threshold at which we want to consider really diving in on this and having more information and more insight about how much water is being used.
Yeah. Thanks,
And
thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the positioning of the three things, right? The critical mining and the ag and the computing, all of those things, just them. And then when you put energy into that, those are four massive pieces that all impact the system. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, you
You really
very
did
much
great.
bit off a large a large bite with all three of, but it's true that they are converging on the region at the same time, and we can't consider this new increased water use of data centers in a vacuum and not acknowledge we have other large water using industries who may be requiring more water, for example, in the case of agriculture, with very high consumptive use. So.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
And we have a question from Ohio from one of our representatives there. So I am concerned about House Bill 392 and its ramifications. Do you think it has any legs?
I don't know the answer to that question. I know that I submitted testimony in opposition, so that's available on the website if you'd like to go see what I said, asking some of these questions about how will the state accommodate for future environmental impacts? How will we enforce existing environmental regulations? Because one of the provisions of that bill actually says that it not only new regulations that target data centers, but also like enforcement of existing laws. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I do think it's telling that that another state has enacted it, right? It was enacted in Montana. Now Ohio and Montana are two different places. But I do think that without raising those kinds of questions and asking, what will the impact of this be, and why should we narrow the ability of the state and local government to regulate this industry? So we provided our piece there. So.
And so, and just to connect it correctly in my brain, so that is that's the piece of legislation in Ohio that would prevent local governments from restricting data center development.
Correct. It actually is not just local governments, it's actually the state
Oh,
government as well.
okay.
So we had a big concern about that aspect of it and the ability of the state agencies in Ohio to, what happens if the Department of Natural Resources, for example, wants to enforce that 100,000 gallon per day threshold of registration for a data center that is withdrawing its own water, right? Is that a compelling government interest? And the lower standard that government is used to dealing with is rational basis. And then also, does it have a chilling effect? Does it cause local communities to not want to even consider a moratoria or imposing any kind of zoning requirement for fear of litigation or violating that statute? So again, I don't know if that piece of legislation has legs, but it was very concerning to see, and also concerning to see that it had actually been enacted elsewhere.
Great. All right, another question here. Considering these rapidly expanding demands, is a regional scale water budget model needed to assess the overall water demands of the Great Lakes watershed rather than state by state uncoordinated efforts?
Yeah, I think the answer could be both. I think that's a really great potential solution. One of the questions that I sometimes get, right, we addressed the impact to groundwater and this threat to groundwater integrity because that is where I can look and say we have groundwater mapping, we have studies that can indicate the impact to groundwater resources. We know it could impact groundwater recharge and these kinds of things. What we have less of an understanding of is what is the impact of these data centers and increasing consumptive use on the Great Lakes themselves. We know that, I think from the last cumulative impacts assessment that the Great Lakes Commission did, that lake levels, they fluctuate year to year based on precipitation, climate change. And so we know that there's that change. But what is the impact of all of the communities across the Great Lakes region adding new large water users, including, the indirect effect of the water use at power plants across the region? I have a chart in the report that looks at our consumptive use since 2015, and that has generally declined since 2015. And that is primarily due to the retirement of coal-fired power plants. So the question is, should we return to a time when we really weren't considering what the impact of all of that increased consumptive use was on the lakes? Or should we consider and find out what that impact will be to the Great Lakes system? I think, again, we turned to groundwater because that was a little bit easier to identify what those potential impacts could be. But I think more research is absolutely needed to determine what is the impact of that increased consumptive use on the lakes.
Great. And then, before we transition over, does the Alliance for the Great Lakes currently have plans in the future for more studies or looking at this issue a little bit more, and anything you can speak to on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that research need that I just identified about the impact of the lakes is one I'm very interested in pursuing further. So definitely going down that rabbit hole to figure out if we can model that, if we can quantify it in some way. I have seen one research paper out of Purdue that kind of do this where information has been released from companies like Google and Intel, and it uses a mathematical model to illustrate how where you site these facilities really can have more or less of a water resources impact. So there's a model there that's been adapted, and I'm looking at can we take that model and apply it to the Great Lakes system? What will the impact be to the lakes? And we know that, there is capacity. Perhaps the Great Lakes region is a place where these facilities can be sited sustainably. But I think without that research to help inform and ensure that and be confident in that decision, that's something that we have to pursue further.
Oh, great. Well, then we'll keep our eye on that and definitely keep us in mind as you're looking at that study and conducting that to see if there can be any partnership opportunities.
Absolutely.
I would
So
just say, I mean, 2 years ago when this first popped in on us, really when we first started reading articles about what was going on in other states, um, when I talked to the folks in the compact, I talked to the USGS and Michigan GS and a number of organizations and said, what do we know when you take agriculture? I wasn't thinking about critical mining at the time, and even just adding agriculture in because Michigan is such an agricultural state, as are most of the Great Lakes states and provinces, right? Um, they were not concerned at all. We don't have to worry about the Great Lakes. There's plenty of water there, but you think about that plus that whole new community outside Chicago now that's asking for an additional diversion from Lake Michigan, right? Another billions of gallons a day kind of diversion. It's only going to the demands are only going to continue to increase in significant ways, not small ways.
hmm Yeah, it's that convergence of demand, from all sectors that really, what is the impact of that? How will that play out across the region? And I think there's some fundamental questions we need to be asking, and what policy changes can we take now to sort of mitigate against future impacts of climate change and increased consumptive use of water. And that's why we really focused on that increased consumptive use, because we know that that water isn't necessarily returned to the watershed. Less than 1% of the Great Lakes are replenished each year through rainfall and snow melt and groundwater flows. So it really is finite, and it requires that managed balancing of withdrawals. And so that's what our report tries to make the case for.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to switch over to Senator Baer to kind of talk through how she's tackled this issue as a legislator, and then how the work of the GLLC Water Use Committee is ramping up on this.
Great, thank you, Jess, and thank you again so much, Helena. That was really excellent, and your report is good. I highly recommend everyone read that, and I assume we'll get copies of that presentation also, and that could be helpful for everybody too. There's some good stuff in there. So quickly, a little bit about Michigan. It's probably a lot of the same things you guys have noticed from the beginning. We saw those first articles a couple of years ago on hyperscale data centers. And to know that they really are massive collections of computers. They don't require a lot of employees. That's a trick that doesn't work when it comes to whether you want them or not. They do use an awful lot of energy and water for cooling. They one of the things I wanted to note, because they are basically data centers. So anything that uses computers like that, um, it's more efficient for them to put it in one place than to have them scattered around. So AI is in there, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin mining, that's the same kind of thing. It's not a different thing that you have to regulate differently. It's anything that uses those kind of massive piles of computers. So when you do work on legislation, to hold that, because people will say, well, crypto is different. We want to, no, it isn't. It isn't. It isn't. So we just have to pay attention to things like that. It's all about technology and the use of the building. And when we talk, like Helena was just talking, it's the cost of having those is the same regardless. We have issues around energy and water regardless. We need to pay attention to that, all kinds of businesses. So the buildings are massive. They now go up to 7 million square feet. One of the ones in Nevada is 7 million square feet. Our new one that just got approved in Saline is 1.5 gigawatts of energy, which serves over a million houses. Would be 1.05 million houses would use that same level of energy. Just think about that. And it causes noise in your neighboring buildings over 90 decibels. So it's kind of like sitting right next to a leaf blower all the time. And per Google, when they first came to Michigan, they told us they were going to be using 5 million gallons of consumptive water use a day. So that was the highest number we've ever seen. And you saw a little bit about our water assessment tool. We do measure, start tracking and run the water assessment tool at 100,000 gallons or 200,000 gallons, and then at 1 million gallons, they go through a more detailed assessment. At 2 million. There's a whole bunch of other things they have to do. Still doesn't. We don't have anybody at 2 million yet. So 5 is way the heck up there beyond anything we've seen. So we are, but like every other state and province, probably, we are always striving and competing to bring in new jobs and new businesses. These don't have many jobs, and we're not really sure of what they're good for yet, but we're working on that. So late spring, we had our first bills came in from the House, and of course, they were tax incentive bills, just how most places are revved up for this. In Michigan, we ran into trouble because we have other incentives that they can take advantage of. We have something called a dark store bill, if you have that. Data centers are basically big fat warehouses with, power cords in them that use electricity. So they can be considered dark stores. There's no parking lots, there's no pile of people and things you have to do as a retail store would have to do. It's just a big warehouse, and we give them tax breaks. So they get away with that. Usually they get extra, whether you think that the local government is going to get this money, that was kind of the push in Michigan, the incentive for our little towns to fall for this. You're going to get tax money. And then they go ahead and then get the dark store, which impacts the local taxes. And then many in Michigan do a Renaissance zone. So low income communities can also do impact of that. And there goes the rest of their local taxes. So lots of opportunity for the big companies to take advantage of small towns who don't understand. But the dark store thing is something we're trying to fix in Michigan. If you have one of those, watch out for data centers in that place. They're going to want more tax breaks. So we have worked to try to slow things down. Mostly we've failed in most things. We do have the water assessment tool, which is going to help in some places. We don't really do any reporting except for that. So in that permitting process, they can find out things. Because we got the exception in the current data center bills to require them to use municipal providers, we can see data from them, and we're building toward getting more data from them for other purposes. which will help us be able to see those kind of large changes and see what's going on from that perspective. But we do feel like we need to and have drafted legislation for ongoing reporting, and we're going to continue to push on that. More and more now that there's been more and more noise out in the community. On the energy side, we have a 2030 clean energy mandate in Michigan. They can either make their own or they can buy energy from our two large providers. The downside, so the data centers have to align or accept the 2030 clean energy mandates, or they buy energy from our providers. And the providers, those two large providers, have off ramps in that requirement. If there is a sudden increase in demand that they cannot keep up with using just clean energy, then they can go ahead and, disregard the clean energy requirements. And that is likely to happen. We're worried about those off ramps being used because of this sudden and high demand increase in energy. So we have a new project, the one that mentioned in Saline, which is close to 1.5 gigawatts. That provider, I talked to directly about it. They were very excited to tell me that it was closed loop water system, which is good. But no explanation for how they were going to source the 1.5 gigawatts. Just didn't answer the question over and over again. So that's a problem for us. The one good thing we got, our Public Service Commission was able to add ratepayer protection. So one of the things we worry about, both energy and water, is the cost of infrastructure upgrades to deliver the additional electricity and to deliver the water if they're using a whatever kind of cooling system, if they're using a water cooling system. That infrastructure, who's going to pay for that? And so in the energy side, our Public Service Commission managed to put restrictions in there to protect ratepayers. On the water side, we have nothing like that. We have no restrictions. We do have bills to do this, and we're going to, again, continue to push forward. We have four or five different bills now having to do with ratepayer protections and water restrictions, and then some energy stuff. So that piece is the second of the two exceptions that we have, little small wins. So we don't have any noise restrictions at all other than local ordinances. And we have seen this in the UP. It's a smaller data center. It's not what we would call hyperscale, but it already is so loud, and it was put into a community space. And it impacts, all around the town, the noise, they can hear it all the time. So, but it was too late. Small governments are, inconsistent when it comes to capabilities in Michigan. We don't really have any rules about having people that are knowledgeable about things like this. So, sometimes they kind of get wooed. The first time this happened 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, the local government were literally wooed. They were, wowed. They got to go on the trip out to west, out to California. They got to, get a really cool jacket, and but they don't really understand all the other factors. So part of our work is trying to find ways to get information out to communities on the risks, and they're starting to be noticed. I don't know if you guys are seeing this, but we've had a lot of pushback. The one in Saline, because the people did not know about it until after the local government had agreed to the new data center, the people are just yelling and screaming. And I don't know if the community benefit agreement is going to be enough to cause that to quiet down. The company, the city, or the town tried to cancel it. The company threatened to just flat out, we're going to stomp on you, kind of thing. So, and I think that the town backed off. So that'll be interesting to watch. I know that there's another small community here in my county where the people are screaming and yelling, and they have not agreed yet. So I have a feeling that one's not going to go forward. I mean, we're starting to see people are paying attention. If they know in time, they're paying attention. So our bills also include a repeal of the tax exemptions, which Minnesota's kind of being a rock star on some things. They have already repealed their tax exemptions. I think they're farther ahead than most of the states and provinces in the GLLC here. And there's some other good examples that were in that presentation today, so we'll keep track of those too. But Minnesota is doing a great job of trying to be in front of this so we can learn from them and use some of their stuff. Other than that, I think that's most of kind of where we are. If you guys have other things that are farther along than that, that would be great to hear about it, or other ideas. We are, as a committee for the GLLC, we want to work toward making recommendations for all of us on the Great Lakes. And so that's why we had this presentation. We've had other presentations in other meetings. We have a lot of work to do, but we would like to come up with recommendations. And so we're hoping that some of you all will want to be a part of that and will join the committee. You can join in the chat, or you can send Jess a email and let us know. And hopefully I will see you at the next meeting. Thanks, Jess.
Thank you so much, Senator. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I want to quickly share some notes about upcoming webinars from CSG Midwest. We have 2 happening next week and another in December. So please do visit our website if you are interested in registering for those. Otherwise, this presentation and recording will be sent out and available on our website. So thank you so much for your participation and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Elena. Thanks, everybody.